The colony's farmland stood outside the walls of the town. Here, grains like rye and barley were raised. But by far, their most successful crop was corn, a New World plant that had been unknown to them back in England. American Indians had shown the colonists that the best way to grow corn was to use dead fish. Holes were dug, the fish were thrown in, covered with dirt, and then the seeds were planted on top. That way, when the fish rotted, they fertilized the corn plants and helped them grow. In the fall, when the plants were fully grown, the corn was harvested. Back in the village, the women prepared the ears for drying by braiding them together. After the ears had completely dried, the kernels of grain were removed. Then they were stored and could be ground into cornmeal whenever needed to make things like bread or porridge. The corn crops at New Plymouth were so good sometimes that extra corn was traded to the native people for valuable furs. These furs were shipped back to England and used to pay off the colony's debts. By 1627, the raising of cattle had also become a very important way of making a living, because cattle could be easily sold to new colonists from England for high prices. Getting enough food for the animals was a lot of work, since to make hay, acres of grass had to be slowly cut by hand, raked up, collected, and then prepared for drying. The dried hay was stored for the winter in the Dutch barn, whose roof could be raised higher and higher as more hay was added. It took a good supply of hay, not just for the cattle, but also for the colony's goats, which were valuable as milk producers. Hay was also fed to the colony's sheep that were important for their wool, from which cloth was made. The colony's pigs ate mostly scraps and acorns and didn't need hay. Even so, each autumn many of them were butchered and their meat salted for winter use. As we have just seen, the Plymouth colonists were able to raise most of what they needed, but it was still not enough. That was why they also hunted wild game and collected shellfish and other creatures that lived in the bay, so they always would have enough to eat. Besides providing food, there were lots of other tasks that needed to be done each day to keep the colony running smoothly. Ordinary things, such as preparing a supply of fuel for the blacksmith shop, making lumber for new houses, digging post holes for fences, or drying reeds for thatching. Having to do these jobs kept the people of New Plymouth very busy 6 days a week. But Sunday was the exception, for on that day it was forbidden to work, and everyone headed off to the meeting house to attend religious services. And so on that one special day that was given over to worship, the entire village shut down and became an unusually peaceful place. People from New Plymouth started to settle on the northern lands that became the colony of New Hampshire as early as 1623. Although 18 years before, a group of English colonists had tried to establish a colony called Popham Plantation a bit further north in present-day Maine, but their attempt failed within a year. The first successful English settlement in this region occurred when Plymouth colonist David Thompson began trading furs and fishing near the mouth of the Piscataqua River, seen here. A few years later, the English government handed over a huge tract of land that included this area to two men, Ferdinando Gorges and John Mason. Soon the pair divided the land in half. The land to the north of the Piscataqua River, that is today Maine, went to Gorges. Mason got all the land to the south and named it New Hampshire. New Hampshire's first town, called Strawberry Bank, grew up along the river a few miles inland from the first English settlement. It became today's city of Portsmouth. As New Hampshire's first town was being settled, a great migration of Puritans had begun just to the south. This colony was called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It rapidly developed two main towns, Salem and Boston, under the leadership of its governor, John Winthrop. During the 1630s, thousands of Puritan colonists came to Massachusetts, hoping to find religious freedom, to escape economic hardships in England, and to build a model community for the entire world to see. By 1640, while the Plymouth colony had grown to a population of 2,500 people, 20,000 lived in the Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. Plymouth eventually was so overshadowed by its much larger neighbor that it joined up with it. By then, the Massachusetts Bay Colony even controlled the lands of Maine. In Massachusetts, the congregational churches of the Puritans were supported by public taxes. In other words, there was no separation of church and state. Strict Puritan ministers watched over people's lives very closely, and if anyone did anything considered sinful, the ministers served as judges as well. In fact, in 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, Puritan judges convicted 19 people of being witches and had them put to death by hanging. However, well before this time, Puritan ministers, unhappy with things in Massachusetts, had started to look for other places to settle. The colony of Rhode Island was founded in 1636 by a Puritan minister named Roger Williams, who had fled from Salem, Massachusetts, to avoid being sent back to England. Williams' views had gotten him into trouble with church authorities. Like the Pilgrims at Plymouth, he became a separatist, but he also believed that people should have complete freedom to choose what religion they wanted to follow, and that churches should be kept separate from government. Roger Williams didn't think that the King of England had any right to grant colonial charters to lands that belonged to American Indians. In the beginning, he allied himself with the native people and befriended their leaders. He even went on to learn their language and write a book about it. About a quarter-mile from the quiet street seen here, Williams founded Rhode Island's original colonial settlement. A town he named Providence for, as he said, God's merciful providence unto me in my distress, referring to the trouble from which he had escaped back in Massachusetts. It was from here in Providence that the smallest English colony, officially known as the Colony of Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations, began. For many years, the colonial capital was the city of Newport, located on an island called Rhode Island. In the years before the Revolutionary War, Newport rivaled New York and Boston as the greatest port city in the colonies. Newport was also an important center of the shipbuilding industry, and for a while was the largest slave trading port in the world. In the 1600s, Rhode Island had become a place that welcomed all faiths, not just Puritans. Reminders of this fact can still be found in Newport today, for it is home to the oldest Jewish synagogue in the United States. Its first congregation assembled in 1658. Nearby is a meeting house founded by a group of Quakers a few years later. It stands just across the street from America's oldest surviving tavern. 250 years ago, the White Horse was a favorite gathering place for Rhode Island's colonial legislators. The colony of Connecticut lay to the west of Rhode Island and was founded in 1636, at the same time Rhode Island was being founded. But before the English ever arrived in the region, a non-English colony, New Netherland, had on and off claimed the land west of the Connecticut River. In fact, in 1633, Dutch fur traders established an outpost here. That same year, a Puritan from Massachusetts set up his own trading post nearby, and the town of Windsor developed from it. Soon, other settlers came from Massachusetts and started the town of Wethersfield to the south. As more English people arrived from Massachusetts, the Dutch gave up their trading post on the river, and English settlers built the town of Hartford there. It is now the capital of the state of Connecticut. In 1636, these three towns united to form the original